I, Arya Dow, welcome you all on behalf of the Extramural Lectures team, IIT Madras, for a very special lecture on India in UNSC 2021-22 by none other than India's former permanent representative to the UN, T.S. Tirumurti sir. Before we begin with the lecture, I would like to invite Chandramouli sir, who will introduce us to CIC.
Thank you very much. It's indeed a pleasure to be here amongst the brightest, the best and the brightest minds of India. So let me just say a few words about CIC. Well, we are a not-for-profit organization, and we were formed to promote exchange of information and ideas in various fields, especially in education, business, finance, economics, arts and commerce, literature, law, science and technology, and any subject which interests the intellectual elite of the state. We were founded in 2016, and it is an organization which was founded by the city's accomplished industrialists and professionals. And our objective is to create an intellectual hub for the city's intelligentsia to meet, share, discuss, and evolve transformational ideas. We aspire, the CIC aspires to be a spa for the mind and the soul. We have about 300 odd fellows, and the number is growing, whose only idea is to regularly invite accomplished Indian and global personalities to share experiences and vision in their respective areas of expertise. Our fellows are professionals, entrepreneurs, academicians, environmentalists, administrators, media persons, and historians who are dedicated towards contributing to shaping the economic, social, and political gradient of our country. We were founded in 2016, and so far we have held more than 160 events at various venues, and our latest attempt is to reach out to the campuses of the city. So we had our last event was the Chief Economic Advisor, and he spoke at the Etiraj College. Before that, we had the Advisor to the Prime Minister, who spoke at the Vaishnav College. So we are attempting to reach out to the next generation with speakers who have excelled in their various fields of expertise. So I'm happy to welcome today our speaker, Mr. T.S. Tirumurti, a very distinguished diplomat, and if I may say so, a good friend of mine. We were from the same batch of the civil services. He's a good friend, an academician, a writer, and of course, he is here to speak about India and the United Nations at a very, very crucial period of world history, when again the world was threatened with a Cold War-like, bloc-like situation. How India steered the dialogue of the day away from these two blocs. I think this is what would be very interesting to hear. So without further ado, let me not stand between you and the eminent speaker of today. I welcome Shri Tirumurti to please come on stage. Now I would request Arya to please introduce our speaker of the day.
Ambassador T.S. Tirumurti sir was a career Indian diplomat with a career spanning 37 years. Since joining the Indian Foreign Services in 1985, he has represented India's interests in various capacities before retiring in June 2022. He served as the permanent representative of India to the United Nations in 2020-22. He was president of the UN Security Council for August 2021 and chair of Taliban Sanctions Committee, of Libyan Sanctions Committee, and also of Counter-Terrorism Committee of the Security Council. Prior to this, he was the secretary in the Ministry of External Affairs, handling the economic relations portfolio between 2018 to 2022. Ambassador Tirumurti has previously served at the Indian Embassy in Cairo, Egypt, where he got his diploma in Arabic language. He was first secretary at the Permanent Mission of India to the UN in Geneva, Switzerland. He was also the first Indian representative to the Palestinian Authority in Gaza. He also served as the Undersecretary in Bhutan, Director in Foreign Secretary's Office, and Joint Secretary in Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Myanmar, and Maldives during his stints at the Ministry of External Affairs in New Delhi. He has also been India's negotiator in climate change and environment-related issues for several years. He has degrees in commerce and law. He is also the author of 3 books. We are really honored to have you here with us today, sir. And moving on, I would like to invite EML Coordinator Mahesh to welcome Tirumurti sir with fruit basket as a token of our respect. Now I would like to request Tirumurti sir to deliver his talk.
My dear friend and colleague, Mr. Chandramouli, distinguished representatives of IIT Madras, and my dear friends. It's indeed a great pleasure to be here at the invitation of the Chennai International Center, a very prestigious institution with dynamic people both at the helm and as members. Being a Chennai Vasi, I'm delighted that I got this opportunity to be in an iconic institution we have all grown up with, IIT Madras. And I thank the vibrant student community of IIT Madras for hosting me. I've had the privilege to collaborate with IIT Madras and its distinguished professors when I was secretary in the Ministry of External Affairs. While today's topic is our stint in the UN Security Council for the period 2021-22, it may be useful to get a sense of where the world stood before we got into the Security Council in January 2021. In 2020, we had a once-in-a-lifetime pandemic accosting humanity. Considerable resources were required to sustain people's basic needs, and millions slipped back into poverty. Even a country like China had been shaken, if not stirred, by COVID. Donor countries had to repurpose much of their funds earlier earmarked for sustainable development goals and climate change to cater to the huge humanitarian needs. We now have a situation where there is hardly any money for the 2 major goals which the international community has set for themselves: reaching the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030 and the Paris climate targets by 2030. Developing countries are facing mounting debts. Next came the search for vaccines, and then came the challenge of administering them. We saw the Western world reacting in the most unexpected ways, including hoarding vaccines twice or thrice over the requirement, thereby preventing large parts of the global South from acquiring them. The fact that India donated vaccines to numerous developing countries and that we also prioritize the small states, particularly the small island developing states, and also our neighbors, has not been lost on the global South. The pandemic has in fact exposed the weakness of the global South and made them appear before us for what they are rather than what they had earlier projected themselves to be. And just when we thought that the pandemic will have a sobering effect on conflicts, we have seen new conflicts break out and old ones get worse. Now the entire West is at war. And we had aggression on our borders as well by China. We also had Pakistan never relenting on cross-border terrorist attacks. This was the scenario when we entered the Security Council on the 1st of January 2021. Friends, India joined the UN as a founding member in 1945, 2 years before our independence. We had 2 signatories when the UN Charter was signed, one for British India and the other for princely states, Sir A. Ramaswamy Mudaliar and Sir V.T. Krishnamachari, respectively. And over the years, our contribution has not only been significant, but pioneering in numerous ways. As an example, one of the areas we have been pioneers in has been the contribution of Indian women in shaping the United Nations. Indian women leaders have consistently left a mark on the UN. Mrs. Vijayalakshmi Pandit became the first woman president of the UN General Assembly. Dr. Hansa Mehta changed the text of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights from all men are created equal to read all human beings are created equal. Begum Sharifa Hamid Ali and Mrs. Lakshmi Menon have left their indelible imprint on UN work. We have been pioneers in women-led UN peacekeeping when Indian women peacekeepers went to Liberia to lead the first ever woman UN peacekeeping contingent. And during our stint in the Council, we have contributed to pursue the women, peace and security agenda in conflict areas, where we have underlined that stopping violence and exploitation of women in conflict situations has to be of paramount importance. Friends, you all know that India has just concluded its 8th two-year stint in the Security Council in February 2022. It has been my privilege to serve as India's ambassador and permanent representative in the Council for 18 out of these 24 months. I was the first ambassador to arrive in Manhattan, New York at the height of COVID in 2020. When the world was shut down, I took one of the relief flights and landed in New York with 4 pieces of baggage, which were my belongings for the next 6 months. I remember converting a room in our office into a studio to be able to attend all UN meetings, which were being held virtually. The UN Security Council finally opened up for physical meetings around May 2021. Let me say that our stint in the Council was unprecedented. Now, I'm not saying that because I was ambassador for most part of the 2-year stint. India has been 7 times on the Council earlier, and in each one of these stints, we have seen big challenges. However, I feel that this was probably the first stint in the Council when many of these challenges came all together in one stint. And that's why I say that this has been unprecedented. In this, I was fortunate to work with and benefit from an extraordinarily dynamic, focused, and hardworking team in the Permanent Mission of India in New York, assisted by our equally capable and ever dependable colleagues from the Ministry of External Affairs. When we entered the Council, we had clear priorities on what to do. We focused inter alia on maritime security, terrorism, UN peacekeeping, reform multilateralism, and the Global South. India was elected chairs of 3 important committees of the Security Council, namely the Taliban Sanctions Committee, the Libyan Sanctions Committee, and the Counter-Terrorism Committee. I am confident that we moved the needle forward in all our priority areas and took important, even pioneering steps. During our presidency in August 2021, India held its first high-level Security Council meeting on maritime security. For the first time, the Prime Minister of India chaired a Security Council meeting, even if virtually. The presidential statement, which was adopted by the Security Council, was the first holistic document on the issue of maritime security, which comprehensively covered a range of issues relating to it, including, for the first time, a direct reference to the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea as international law, setting out the legal framework in the context of maritime activities. It also called for, inter alia, freedom of navigation, anti-piracy, and combating terror and transnational crimes at sea. And you all know, in the current scenario, how sensitive the topic of maritime security is. The negotiations were difficult, and my colleagues handled them with great deftness and brought all members on board. And I'm confident that this will serve as a template to build on in the future. Coming to the next priority of terrorism, when we entered the Council, we were determined to sustain the collective fight against terrorism. You should not forget the centrality which terrorism occupies whenever we discuss international peace and security. It is being used as an instrument of war by states and exploited by terrorists to destabilize democratic societies and their social fabric. India has been the foremost victim of cross-border terrorism. The specter of terror by ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and Islamic jihadist terrorist groups in our neighborhood and in the Middle East is now spreading very fast in Africa as well. But what I want to underline here is that there still exists considerable hesitancy to fight terrorism in all its forms and manifestations, especially those that are based on radical and violent religious ideologies. Just when we need collective action, the world is divided on fighting terrorism. What I mean is that before 9/11 happened in the United States, September 11, 2000, the world was divided into your terrorists and my terrorists. But 9/11 proved that terrorism in one part of the world could devastate even the center of Manhattan. And when this shook the world, suddenly it became a collective fight. They became our terrorists. In the last 20 years or more, there have been significant strides taken to bring this collective focus to tackle many aspects of terrorism, especially financing of terrorism, nexus with other transnational crimes, Islamic jihadist terror, etc. We are also in an era when contemporary and emerging technologies are being weaponized by terror groups and individuals. Each of these sources are coming under the scanner. However, while there is definitely a more concerted effort, at a broader level, there is a more disconcerting scenario which is unfolding. After more than 20 years of 9/11 uniting us to fight the common menace of terror, we are in the danger of drifting back to the era of your terrorists and my terrorists. If you look at the scenario unfolding, Europe is now preoccupied with the rise of the right wing and right-wing extremist violence, as they call it. They have identified these right-wing violent attacks as their main terrorist threat. On the other hand, the United States is preoccupied with the rise of racially and ethnically motivated extremism and violence. REMV, that's what they call it, not me. Further, after what happened in Afghanistan, there is apprehension that the US may step back from a more robust strategy to tackle terror in Asia and in Africa. China has claimed that it has its own terror-related issues to tackle, but at the same time are also blocking India's proposals to list terrorists under the Security Council Resolution 1267 relating to sanctions. So we are now back to the era of trying to combat our own terrorists. In other words, back to the era of my terrorists, your terrorists. This preoccupation of the West is also creating the space for Organization of Islamic Conference, OIC, to push its Islamophobia agenda and trying to link terror attacks with Islamophobia, thereby providing a justification for terror. It was thanks to India that we stopped such an attempt of the OIC in 2021 when the global counter-terrorism strategy was being finalized in the UN General Assembly. This year, 2023, this global counter-terrorism strategy will come up for review, and I hope that more countries will come together to prevent any attempt to justify terror on the basis of religion. During both our presidencies in August 2021 and December 2022, we held high-level meetings on terrorism chaired by External Affairs Minister. He laid out an 8-point action plan to fight terror. In a unique initiative, we brought the Counter-Terrorism Committee meeting to India in October 2022, since we were the chair of the Counter-Terrorism Committee. The landmark Delhi Declaration on countering the use of new and emerging technologies for terrorist purposes was adopted, and this declaration focused on 3 key areas. 1, countering terrorist exploitation of information and communication technologies. 2, threats posed by terrorist use of unmanned aerial systems. And 3, countering financing of terrorism as it relates to threats associated with new payment technologies and fundraising methods. India also proposed several names of terrorists for listing under the Security Council Resolution 1267, and this basically relates to sanctions and also to Al-Qaeda and Islamic State, ISIL. And the US was the co-signatory to our proposal. In a significant development, 2 weeks after we left the Council, one of our proposals for terrorists listing under 1267 was approved by the Security Council. This listing was of Abdur Rahman Makki, Deputy Amir and Chief of Lashkar-e-Taiba, and this was the first listing with India as a proposer in the Council. This was also the first terrorist to be expressly named for terrorist acts in Jammu and Kashmir. And this, in my opinion, is a very big success for our diplomacy. Friends, the Security Council's agenda is overflowing with conflicts between states, primarily, some of which go back decades. Newer conflicts get added on year after year. Most remain unresolved. Old conflicts on the Security Council agenda, which has been festering, it includes Syria, Libya, Somalia, Central African Republic, Sudan, South Sudan, North Korea, and the Sahel region. Some got progressively worse. For example, Afghanistan, Yemen, Palestine, Democratic Republic of Congo, Mali, Burkina Faso, and Haiti. And to add to an already overloaded agenda of the Council, several new ones were added, including Myanmar, Ethiopia, Guinea, and of course, finally, Ukraine. The fact that we were in the Security Council when all this was happening is, in my opinion, a very happy coincidence, since we could contribute in some way when these issues were being addressed. The fact is that billions of US dollars are spent on these conflicts, supporting opposing parties. After spending billions, ironically, billions more are spent on the humanitarian fallout from these conflicts, with millions affected, especially women, minorities, and children. And the cycle goes on with no end in sight. When we entered the Security Council in January, two conflicts challenged us very close to home in the year 2021. Myanmar witnessed a military takeover soon after we came into the Council on the 1st of February 2021. During our presidency of the Council in August 2021, Taliban forcefully seized power in Afghanistan. And then, of course, came the Ukraine conflict in February 2022. Before I come to these conflicts, let me put things in a certain context. The failure of UN leadership in conflicts is evident in the way they react to forcible takeover of power. It starts with the way they deal with conflicts and who deals with them, the yardstick that we apply to resolve them, the interference of outside players, the proxy wars that they fight, and even the counterproductive nature of the remedies proposed, especially unilateral remedies. And of course, disregard for what the parties actually need to stop the conflict. I thought it would be useful for you to get an idea of how the international community, particularly the West and the P5, dealt with military and other forceful takeover of power, two of which have a direct bearing on India's security. In Myanmar, with which we share 1,670 kilometers of border, when the military took over on the 1st of February, the Security Council immediately called for return to path of democracy, stopping of violence, restoring election results, and release of prisoners. ASEAN, which you know is the regional organization in that region, was expected to lead the way on this issue. However, the West started shifting the goalposts and took an aggressive posture on Myanmar. Even the UN Secretary General's special envoy said that she will stand in the trenches with the opposition and stymied whatever chances she had of visiting Myanmar to actually find a solution. The P5 members were pulling in opposing directions, which, while the ASEAN, they counseled caution. There was a West-led UN General Assembly resolution in which all the neighboring countries and those in the neighborhood, they abstained, while the entire West voted yes. So you can see that the polarization was really very stark. As I said, India shares 1,670 kilometers of border with Myanmar, with 4 northeast states of India bordering it, where I am told that there are now 50,000 refugees from Myanmar. and it was vital to ensure the stopping of violence, bringing in stability, and that the democratic process went forward. With a view to resolving the issues and realizing the sensitivities of the different players on this matter, India worked behind the scenes to ensure balanced and comprehensive Council pronouncements. In fact, the Security Council resolution on Myanmar was adopted under our presidency in December 2022, though actually India abstained on the vote. Coming to Afghanistan, when Taliban forcefully took over power in Afghanistan in August 2021, by coincidence, India was actually presiding over the council. I was president of the council when the news of takeover of Taliban came. This gave India an opportunity to bring to bear on the discussions our deep understanding of the situation in Afghanistan and of the requirements and welfare of the Afghan people. Ironically, however, unlike the Myanmar situation, which I just mentioned, the West engaged with Taliban straight away. In fact, the UN Secretary General's Special Envoy and senior UN officials fell over themselves to engage with Taliban. The then UN Special Envoy came to the council during one of our meetings and even argued on behalf of the Taliban. Barring France, the other 4 members of the P5, that's the permanent 5 members, justified working with Taliban on the grounds that Taliban is a part of the Afghanistan polity, not conceding the fact that even Myanmar military was very much part of the Myanmar constitution, which reserves 25% seats for the military. The contrast could not have been more stark. Once again, India played a quiet but determined role in steering discussions and negotiation in a very constructive direction. This finally resulted in the adoption of a very important Security Council resolution. Its number is 2593. We are all very fond of numbers in the Security Council. But this was basically a resolution in Afghanistan, and this was on the very last day of our presidency in August. This resolution, 2593, it laid down clear benchmarks which Taliban had to meet, including stopping cross-border terrorism from Afghan soil, including from proscribed UN terrorist entities in Pakistan under 1267, on protecting rights of women and minorities and children, on ensuring an inclusive government, or on providing humanitarian assistance. Our consistent caution to the council members to go slow on their engagement with Taliban fell on deaf ears. The UN report itself pointed out that Haqqani network is still regarded as having the closest link to Al-Qaeda, but not many in the council or in the UN Secretariat gave this report the importance it deserved. Finally, all this came to a head when the council members saw for themselves things taking a turn for the worse, in that terrorism didn't decrease but actually increased. Taliban's link with Al-Qaeda continued, if not strengthened. The most severe restrictions were imposed on women and girls, and there was no inclusive government in sight. In effect, the UN did opposite of what they did in Myanmar and failed again, at least so far. I'm convinced that our position on Taliban upholding these benchmarks continues to be the best course of action for the Council and for all of us. Staying on the topic of military takeovers, when the first military takeover happened in Mali in August 2020, the Security Council treated it with kid gloves. There wasn't the usual consternation like Myanmar, but it was felt that they needed to work with the military to restore democracy, since it was felt it was a good coup because the people welcomed it. But with the terrorists and the Islamic radicals threatening the Mali government, the military did a second takeover of power in Mali in May 2021. Suddenly, this good coup became a bad coup when the discussions failed and the French troops, and they are, as you know, the former colonial masters, they were asked to leave, and the Russian-linked Wagner group came in. I don't think anyone really seemed concerned about what the government of Mali actually needed to win this war against terrorists and the Islamic jihadist radicals. Finally, there were 2 more military takeovers, first in the Republic of Guinea, another in Burkina Faso, which the Council almost forgot. In fact, they ignored it. So this is just to give you a flavor of how different standards were applied to different situations. So when people ask why is the UN Security Council not able to preserve international peace and security, the reasons are not far to seek. However, it was during the Ukraine conflict that India's independent stand showed the world that we need to do whatever it takes to create space for dialogue and diplomacy, even in the midst of intense fighting and high emotions when all the levers were being weaponized. To state the obvious, our decision of 27th February last year to abstain on the Council vote on the draft resolution on Ukraine was not taken lightly. Interestingly, while Russia vetoed the draft, all three Asian countries abstained, including China, United Arab Emirates, and India. And as we mentioned in our explanation of vote, taking into consideration the totality of circumstances, we have decided to abstain. That's what he said. India's position has been consistent: immediate cessation of hostilities and return to path of dialogue and diplomacy. We do not think that there is a military solution. It is also to our credit that we managed to evacuate citizens to safety in a chaotic and deteriorating landscape, barring the tragic loss of one student. Considerable pressure was brought to bear on India both in Delhi and in New York. We faced pushback from our own friends. The impact of the conflict not just paralyzed the work of the United Nations, but soon exacerbated food, fertilizer, and fuel insecurity, especially in developing countries. Realizing the impact on food security, India immediately allowed exports of wheat to countries in need, including Afghanistan, Myanmar, Sudan, and Yemen. In the Council, we spoke out forcefully against sanctions, which were causing distress to the global south. In fact, Ukraine is a prime example of weaponization of everything, including social media, cyber and digital space, finance, food, energy, and of course, arms and ammunition. Let me also state that it was our independent and proactive stand which has been a catalyst in helping other developing countries voice their dissatisfaction with how both sides have conducted this conflict. Many of the bigger countries in the developing world, including India, Indonesia, South Africa, Algeria, Angola, Gabon, which is, by the way, the current member of the UN Security Council, Mozambique, which is another current member of the Security Council, Bangladesh, Vietnam, and others, they refused to take sides, shrugged off pressure, and rejected the push for a military solution. They too want a diplomatic solution. We have also seen the fallout of the Ukraine conflict in the G20 foreign ministers and finance ministers meetings where no consensus document could be issued. Consequently, I personally think it's time for India, as a big power in its own right and as the current president of the G20, to take our independent position forward and put it in action by taking an initiative on this conflict. And if we don't, others who are more biased and less credible will do so. Friends, when I made my first statement after entering the Council during the flag installation ceremony, I underlined inter alia that India will be a voice for the developing world, and we lived up to that. Our close engagement with the developing world, especially Africa and the Middle East, was reinforced in the Council given our historic relations with Global South. We stood for their territorial integrity, increased humanitarian and logistical assistance, correcting historical injustice, reform, development partnership, fighting terror, and peaceful resolution of disputes. For example, on Syria, we were forthright and continued to express concern over the presence of foreign troops on Syrian soil, unilateral actions violating Syria's sovereignty and territorial integrity, etc. I'm sure you would have noticed the irony here that some of those who are calling for the respecting territorial integrity and sovereignty of Ukraine are those who actually have their troops inside Syria disregarding these very principles. You have seen that we also hosted the first Voice of Global South Summit in January this year, chaired by our Prime Minister in the context of G20. Friends, on another priority area of ours, India has also been the largest contributor of UN peacekeeping over the decades with around 260,000 troops. We have also tragically had the largest number of those who have paid the supreme sacrifice, 177 of ours. In this context, India has put money where our mouth is by launching the Unite Aware technology platform to strengthen real-time protection of UN peacekeepers. This was during our presidency. And under our presidency in August 2021, we also piloted the first Security Council resolution by India in more than 5 decades, calling for accountability for crimes against peacekeepers. We also gifted 2 lakh vaccines to all UN peacekeepers at the height of COVID. There were also a wide range of thematic issues which had come up in the Council. Some of these issues were not even directly related to international peace and security. For example, climate change. You're aware that over 30 years, from 1992 to 2022, all countries have collectively worked through consensus to create an equitable architecture to combat climate change under the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. This architecture is guided by principles and commitments, the most important of which is common but differentiated responsibilities and of equity. While India has been a champion to combat climate change, in December 2021, the West tried to wrest climate change from this UN Convention on Climate Change and bring it under the ambit of the P5, the Permanent Five in the Council, who are themselves major historical polluters. The draft resolution on this introduced in the Council was defeated, since India voted against the draft while Russia exercised the veto. If it had succeeded, climate change architecture would have by now kept out the voice of most of Global South, especially small island developing states. In our explanation of vote, after the draft resolution was rejected, India clearly mentioned that the UN Security Council is not the place to discuss either climate action or climate justice. In my statement, I emphasized that the draft resolution is an attempt to evade responsibility under the Framework Convention on Climate Change. We pointed out that the UNFCCC addresses holistically all aspects of mitigation, adaptation, financing, technology transfer, capacity building, etc. We stated forthrightly that the real reason to bring such a resolution was that now decisions can be taken without involvement of most developing countries and without recognizing consensus. India further contended that ironically many of the Security Council members are the main contributors of climate change due to historical emissions. If the Security Council indeed takes over the responsibility on this issue, a few states will then have a free hand in deciding on all climate-related issues. This is clearly neither desirable nor acceptable. However, quite apart from what happened in the Council, since I have been a climate change negotiator for 6 years, I must underline that at a much broader level, in the Conference of Parties 27, which was held in Egypt recently under the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, we were witness to how the West is doing its utmost to backslide on their commitments under the Paris Agreement, whether on mitigation or financing, especially for adaptation for developing countries, and trying to shift the burden to bigger developing countries or to market forces. This will be a big setback for the Global South. This comes at a time when India has assumed ambitious mitigation targets, established the International Solar Alliance in India, where more than 100 countries are members, and also offering lifestyle for environment, life, to the world. Another trend which is bound to exacerbate in the future and have a destabilizing effect is a recent rise in the contemporary form of religiophobia. The UN, in its resolutions, have traditionally condemned phobias against the 3 Abrahamic religions, namely Judaism, Islam, and Christianity, and rightly so. Hate should be condemned wherever it exists. However, What the UN and the world has failed to acknowledge is that in the last decade or more, the attacks and hatred against non-Abrahamic religions have increased exponentially, in many cases emasculating minority voices. What we are witnessing now is a more virulent form of religiophobia emerging, including anti-Hindu, anti-Buddhist, and anti-Sikh phobias. Our minister, he pointed this out for the first time in his speech in the UN Security Council in October 2021. He referred in particular to the destruction of temples, the glorification of breaking of idols, violation of Gurudwara premises, the massacre of Sikh pilgrims in Gurudwaras, the destruction of the Bamiyan Buddhas, and other religious iconic sites. Hate crimes against Sikhs and the Hindus have only increased, including in the West and in the US. He reminded the Council, our minister, and I quote, "Our inability to even acknowledge phobias against non-Abrahamic religions only gives encouragement to those who say that phobias against some religions are more acceptable than those against others." These have serious implications for a multicultural, pluralistic, and democratic societies like India. Pluralistic democracies cannot afford to watch the world go down this slippery slope and divide the world both in the UN and outside. And of course, most of you must be aware that our Prime Minister raised the issue of attacks against temples in Australia by Khalistanis with the visiting Prime Minister of Australia. The culmination of our tenure was a Security Council open debate under our presidency in December 2022 on another crucial thematic issue, the need for immediate reform of the Security Council. This was the first debate of its kind in the Council itself. Usually, it takes place every year in the UN General Assembly. India has been one of the strongest proponents of reform of the Security Council to ensure that the Security Council regains its importance and relevance in the contemporary world. In 1945, when UN was established, it had 51 countries, 51 member states. Now we have 193. But the Security Council still retains its anachronistic structure. We have backed the expansion of seats in the Council both in the permanent and in the elected categories. While the debate on reforms has meandered aimlessly, the real world, meanwhile, has changed dramatically. The changes have been evident in the terms of economic prosperity, technological capabilities, political influence, and developmental progress. The broad dispersal of capabilities and responsibilities has been expressed, for example, in the emergence of the G20. However, the UN has carried on as if nothing has changed. The structure of the discussion in the UN is under the intergovernmental negotiating process, and it is deeply flawed. In effect, a small group of countries have turned the discussion into a talk shop by blocking text-based negotiation, and any move forward, blocking the move forward, thereby creating an untenable situation. After decades, we have nothing to show as progress. We are convinced that if the Security Council does not undergo urgent reform, other plurilateral groups like the G20, which has a broader representation, will steal a march over the UN and take away from the UN whatever decision-making authority it still has. There is also no doubt that India has probably the best credentials for a permanent membership of the Council. Friends, I've tried to give you a bird's eye view of some of the highlights during our stint. As you can see now, we have dealt with a tremendous variety of issues in the Council during these 2 years. To sum up, one can probably figure out why this stint of India in the Council has been unprecedented. We have been firm and forthright, but constructive and solution-oriented. We have been the bridge in a polarized Security Council. We have had the global interests in mind, especially of the global South, without compromising on our national interests. In fact, we strive to advance our national interests with an independent and not afraid to stand alone if necessary foreign policy. We showed flexibility where feasible. made our red lines clear, and worked sincerely to bridge divergent positions of council members. Our performance over 2 years is an eloquent testimony as to why India needs to be at the horseshoe table permanently. Friends, allow me to conclude by thanking once again the CIC and particularly Mr. Chandramouli, and of course my very dear friends from IIT Madras, once again for giving me an opportunity to speak to you and to share my thoughts. And I'll be very happy to take questions. You can raise your hands and I'll try to identify. Yeah.
Thank you, sir. So my question is, how do you see India's stance to abstain from diplomatic talks with the Taliban regime in Afghan, despite having several interests, including the responsibility to curb terrorism, to protect its assets in Afghan, and to protect its goodwill among the Afghan people, and also considering the fact that China's emerging presence across the globe, and including the recent emergence as a peace broker between Iran and Saudi Arabia? Don't you think India should reconsider its stand when it is in zenith of its diplomacy because of its multi-alignment policy?
Yeah, just repeat the first half of the question.
Yes, sir. So don't you think,
No, you can just repeat it, just the first half.
Yeah, should we restart our diplomatic talks with Afghan, considering our responsibility to curb terrorism, protect our assets and the Afghan people's goodwill?
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to mention that over the last 20 years, India has been very heavily invested in Afghanistan. We have done projects which are more than $3 billion. We have not only invested in Afghanistan, we have invested very heavily in the people of Afghanistan for the welfare of the Afghans. And it's just a coincidence that I was personally handling our relations with Afghanistan, especially our development partnership with them. And the number of Afghan students who have benefited by our HRD and other programs is huge. And they are the future of Afghanistan. And we have done projects which are directly benefiting the people of Afghanistan. So we have come to a point when, do you want this link between us and the people, what we have done in Afghanistan, to go away merely because that we have the Taliban takeover of power? Now, this is an important matter which you need to consider. The second aspect is that, there are neighbors. Like I was mentioned for Myanmar, it has a direct impact when there is lack of stability inside Myanmar. It does a fallout in India. It's very easy to take a position when you're 10,000 miles away. But it's very difficult to take the same position when you have a neighbor and when things are not going the way you should. So therefore, I think it has not been easy for us, let me say very clearly, to take a position where, on the one hand, yes, they have to conform to those benchmarks, which is really what I was mentioning in my speech. But at the same time, we are heavily invested in the people. We are heavily invested in Afghanistan. And I'm not talking about money. And that is where I think they genuinely feel that India should continue our engagement. The schools, the education, the universities, and they are all, in fact, many of them are coming here and the thousands study here. So I think we need to continue some sort of an engagement for the benefit of the Afghan people. And I think that's why, it's not an easy decision, but it's an important decision we'll have to make, which we have done. Yeah.
Sir, thanks, Ambassador, for a very enlightening talk on the geopolitics. There was one interesting reference you made to Ukraine, that India should take the initiative to resolve the Ukraine issue. Can you please expand on that?
No, thank you very much. Of course, Ukraine is the hot topic of the day, and I can understand the interest in this. India has been in the Security Council. We dealt with Ukraine, and now we are president of G20. And I think it's about time. We have also, sort of, as I mentioned, we have maneuvered ourselves to come to strategic space where we have taken an independent stand. And thanks to what we have done, we have steeled the nerves of many developing countries to take a similar stand. And that has frankly made a huge impact. I've just told you the list of countries, which are major developing countries, which have taken an independent stand saying that I won't join either of your sides. And this initiative, what I had in mind is, in fact, I just like to take you back to 1950 to 1953. I wasn't born then, maybe none of you were, but that was the time of the Korean War. And in 1950-51, that was the first time we were in the Security Council. And during the Korean War, India played an extremely important role. And something very similar happened then. It's not exactly the same, but similar. On the one side, you had the United States supporting the liberal, the South Korean side. On the other side, you had the Soviet Union and China supporting the communist Koreans. And therefore, there was once again, like now, a proxy war being fought in Korea. And India took a very similar stand. We said we are not going to agree to condemnation of both sides, and we managed to get a resolution which did not condemn either of the two sides. And finally, it was thanks to our efforts that we had this armistice agreement in 1953. And in recognition of the important role we played, we became the chairman of the Neutral Nations Repatriation Commission, NNRC. Now this was constituted, and India was made the chair because we were acceptable to both sides. And it was a 5-country commission, 2 from the North Korean side and 2 from the South Korean side, and India was the chair. And this was to deal with the 20,000 plus prisoners of war. And finally, we also sent, I recall, a custodian force. It was Custodian Force of India, where we also managed to maintain peace. So we played that role, and now we are in a unique position, if not the same situation, a unique position of seeing how we can actually come back in again. We have said the same thing, that we don't want a situation where we don't want to be condemnatory of either this side or that side, and we should undertake an initiative, work with both sides and see where it leads. And there is absolutely no harm in trying. We are the president of G20, we are a big country, we have a certain standing, and we are taking an independent position. So I think we should use that to get into it. So that's really what I was trying to say.
Check.
Thank you.
Can I have the next question? Okay. Sir, I read up the history of the Security Council.
Sorry?
I read up the history of the council, and I believe India was offered the membership twice before, both to Jawaharlal Nehru, and Nehru refused to join the council for various reasons. So my question is, the reason why we are probably not offered the membership now, I'm just wondering, maybe 1, 2, 3 things that come to my mind. One is the recent lack of democracy in India, perhaps nepotism that's running wild, and also our performance on the various socio-economic parameters, like the Human Development Index, the Press Freedom Index. We are like ranked like in the 150s high above. So I'm just wondering, how much are these factors the reason for us not being offered the membership the third time? And yeah, just your opinion on that.
No, thank you very much. See, in my understanding, I'm not quite sure that we were really offered the permanent membership of the Security Council. So let me be very frank. It is my understanding that I don't think we were offered, and even if we were offered, I don't think Prime Minister Nehru would have refused. So let us get a bit real on this. It is one thing that he may have said that China ought to be in the council. We may have supported China or something, but I don't think that this is a real, because after all, you must understand that the permanent 5 consists of winners of the war, and they were there for a reason. So I think this is something, and for people, of course, welcome to believe, because when we don't have facts, we always have opinion. So I'm of the opinion that we were not offered this permanent membership. Secondly, coming to this, the other question, see, it's not as if they're offering people any permanent membership. Let me be frank. It's not that they'll say, India, please come, but you're a bad guy, we don't want you. It doesn't work like that. It's not that they are telling Germany that please come and now you may have been defeated in World War II, but you can still come in. It doesn't work like that. It is just that the next expansion of permanent membership, they are hoping that it will be done on a certain criteria. That's number one. Secondly, there is a very clear rule in the charter of who will be a permanent membership. Number one, it needs a charter amendment. That's number one. And secondly, it also needs a country to get 2/3 majority. And third, you should not get vetoed in the Security Council. So you should have, all these criteria. Only if you have it, you get there. And it doesn't matter which country gets it. So it's a very clear path. And now we are trying to see whether we can progress on this reform. It has nothing to do with whether you belong to a communist regime or whether to a democratic setup or whether you're having socialism or ideologically different from the others. So those things that may be considered when people vote for you. And we got 184 votes out of 193 when we entered the Security Council. So, therefore, I think it's very difficult for me to react to this because it depends on voting. And finally, I can assure you that whenever the Security Council reform takes place and it is expanded in the permanent category, India will be the first country to get in. I can assure you that.
Sir, how India is exercising its soft power in order to get the seat in Security Council, even though we are not converging with one of the P5 country, that is China. Second question is, how much India has succeeded in louding its voice that UN need reforms, which is much needed in this scenario?
Yeah, thank you very much. I mean, it's very similar to what he had asked. A country has power. Whether it's soft power or hard power, both count. So, I can only say that the so-called standing, which we discuss about countries, our standing has definitely increased. When it comes, we've just become the 5th largest economy in the world. And apart from that, there are many, many things where the reasons for which our standing has increased in international community. And that is acknowledged. And in fact, when the Ukraine conflict started, within about a week or so of the conflict, in fact, the Secretary General called me, and the UN Secretary General, and he said that, given your standing and also the fact that you have a very strong leadership, and also that you have taken an independent position, that you have actually abstained on the vote, I think you will be, given your democratic credentials, maybe a good bet for someone to talk to both sides. And he mentioned that to me. And I think that is significant, that when it comes to a major conflict, for the first time in after God knows how many years, 75 years in Europe, the Secretary General found it that, I think he found that India as a country could be a country which could talk to both sides. And I think, frankly, that is our standing. And that's why I think we need not worry about soft or hard power. I think our standing will make a huge difference. And and about China, I think we'll come to the bridge, across the bridge when we come to it, because when we go to voting and there's an overwhelming majority of people who want India there, then it will be difficult for countries to be the odd man out and say no. But we haven't yet come to that point. We'll come to it and very soon, I'm sure. Yeah.
Greetings,
Okay.
sir. So my question is, you have talked about forceful takeovers and cross-border terrorism. So with the rise of Taliban in Afghanistan, we have also seen a rise in terrorist activities by TTP or the Tehreek-e-Taliban in Pakistan, which it has claimed responsibility. And also they have recently released a video of them training with US make weapons, which the US military has left in Afghanistan while they were leaving. So despite this, the Indian government is actively trying to collaborate with Taliban by not only allocating about 200 crores in the recent budget, but also inviting them for various sessions, mainly done by IIM Kozhikode. So despite the past and the present activities done by Taliban, is it right for the Indian government to engage with the Taliban government while it stands the risk of Taliban terrorists moving closer to the Indian soil? While I do understand it is necessary to interact with neighbors, is it also necessary to have interact with them while we stand the risk of having terrorist activities going more closer to the Indian soil? Don't you think this is India's actions diverting from what they have been preaching in a long time? And what's your take on it?
No, I think my answer would be very similar to what I had given the previous question. And I think as neighbors, our relationship with countries is multidimensional. It is not unidimensional. And we have to take the totality into consideration. And see, ultimately, there is something called people of Afghanistan. You also have to look at, it is not just two countries looking at each other, or two governments looking at each other, or two regimes looking at each other. You have to look at what is good for the people. And when you factor in people, human beings, into the entire equation, you get a very different result. And this is, I think, important in the context of Afghanistan. That's what I had mentioned to the previous speaker. But let me also say, there is no question of us ignoring terrorism from Afghan soil. In fact, I was president of the council, and at that time, I had worked very closely with the drafters of the council. And you would have seen the reference to what is called 1267 in the resolution. I mean, you don't have to read it, but I'm just telling you, when it comes to terror from Afghan soil, it says that terrorism also from 1267 should not happen. And I mentioned this 1267 reference is important because under this resolution, lot of terrorists and terror groups are sanctioned by the United Nations Security Council. And in that, you have a lot of terrorists and terrorist groups from Pakistan. So we had a hand in making sure that you expressly made sure that they did not take advantage of the situation in Afghanistan and launched cross-border terrorism against India. So I think this, we are very clear that we need to make sure that the benchmarks are adhered to by Taliban. Yeah, I'll take a couple of questions or 3 questions and then answer them together.
Greetings, sir. 2-part. One is land and water. Land in Afghanistan. When Taliban wants to take over, Amrullah Saleh, Hanif Atmar, Dostum, Atta Mohammad Noor, when everybody was pro-India, and we left this guy, poor chap, Ahmad Shah Massoud's son, to fight the Taliban when they were facing the Pakistan Air Force, when the Parwan was pounded. And now Haqqani have already taken. This is one. Similar. Recent past in IORA meeting happened in Bangladesh. The Deputy External Affairs Minister of Somali raised the invitation to Jaishankar sir to look in India to have at least a council office, if not an embassy. My senior, 1 year senior, my batchmate in PhD, have become the president of Somalia, Hassan Sheikh Mahmoud, who's also a student in India, and we are not engaged. And then these two, and even National Economical Council of Somali, they proactively behind India, even RIS, under Sachin sir, they need some opinion and support on building the technical advisory team. And why we are leaving when people come to us, and then what is that? There is a story.
Yeah. I'll take the next question. Any other questions?
Well, I am Ramesh. Well, as of now, we have moved in stature, as per your own words, we have moved very far away in terms of we becoming the statesmen of the international community kind of stuff. When that be the case, do we really need a permanent place in the Security Council at all when we are being called up to stop wars and we have been called up to do all the goodies for this world kind of a thing. And so one seat does not really matter at all, according to me. Your take on that, sir?
Yeah, thank you. One more?
Sir.
Oh, sorry. Okay, yeah.
Good evening, sir. I am Coast Guard Commandant. I want to ask two questions, sir. While you said about the UNCLOS, US is not a signatory to the UNCLOS yet, sir. But in the recent shooting down of a Chinese spy balloon, they took shelter under the UNCLOS. So this attitude of the US, how far it will lead to the global peace? That is one thing, sir. And second question is, while we are dealing with the US in all spheres, like I myself, I've done joint exercise with the US Coast Guard. But it disturbs me, because while, is it because of the big brotherly attitude? So why we should bend over backwards to accommodate US? So this question I couldn't raise in the defense forum, so that's okay. Thank you.
No, thank you. I think I'll just get around to answering. See, I think on Afghanistan, about the opposition and others, this is absolutely a land in turmoil. And I don't think that was the right time to intervene with one or the other. Maybe you're not the United States. In fact, the United States was leaving Afghanistan. So it is not for us to, take the place of the United States to start supporting whether militarily or otherwise one side or the other. That was happening, it was unraveling, and during this type of a situation, there is bound to be, one side or the other. And so we are not here to determine which side wins in Afghanistan, let me be frank. On the other one, your point is well taken. Let me also say that on Somalia, let us look at the type of relationship we had with Somalia. Many, many people in Somalia are all people who are alumni of Indian universities. And we are always very close to them. There is no question at any point of time of ignoring what Somalia wants. And you talked about they require this, and see, I don't want to get into these details, what they asked and what we said no. But we are giving $12.5 billion as lines of credit to Africa. We are giving another $16 billion as lines of credit to our neighbors. We have a total portfolio of nearly $30 billion we are giving all over the world. Our development partnership has really increased by leaps and bounds. And we are in Africa. We are building power plants, we are building water irrigation works, we are doing IT centers, we are doing a whole lot of things. And they are big projects, mind you, infrastructure. And so therefore, I think it's important for us to understand that we are now looking at a very different relationship with Africa, not just with Somalia. And this relationship has transformed. In the last, 7, 8 years or whatever, leaving out COVID, we have had 36 visits by Indian leaders, President, Vice President, and Prime Minister to Africa. This is unprecedented. We have had 18 new missions which we have opened in Africa in the last. This is exponential. So I think I think there is a context with Somalia, and I don't think it is any disregard for Somalia, but I think there must be some context which I'm not specifically aware of. And you asked about whether we need a permanent place in the Security Council. The answer is a resounding yes. The very fact that you had conflicts which have been unresolved, new conflicts which have been unresolved, conflicts which have been there for 20, 30 years, it needs a country like India to be in the council. In fact, the whole problem has come because look at the 5 countries. You have 3 countries which were former colonial masters. You have 2 countries which are the so-called new development partners. And therefore, what are they going to decide about countries in Africa, about countries in other parts of the world, about in the countries in the Middle East? So it is only countries from the region which can give that balance. And that is what we are fighting for. There is no African country which has a permanent. There is no Latin American country which has. Small island states and countries like India. And there are, so these, when countries like ours come in, we will lend that balance and we'll make sure that at least the issues are addressed in a holistic way. So therefore, I think it is absolutely essential we are in the council and in a permanent place in the council. And as far as UNCLOS is concerned, you were mentioning, who was asking the question? Yes. Sir, actually, The US is not a signatory to it, but it understands and values UNCLOS. The very fact that the presidential statement, which our Prime Minister was chairing, they subscribed in the president's statement to UNCLOS being treated as international law. So they agreed to it, and the presidential statement, unlike a resolution, cannot be voted on. It has to be by consensus. And this is something not only the United States, but even China agreed to it. And you know that in UNCLOS, when Bangladesh, we had a maritime dispute with Bangladesh, Bangladesh took us to the UNCLOS, under UNCLOS, they took us to the, it's called the arbitral tribunal. And in that arbitral tribunal, the UNCLOS gave us a ruling. And we are fully committed to implementing it. Whereas, when the Philippines took China under the same article of UNCLOS, the Chinese refused to accept the award. So, this is why I'm saying, but the Chinese, I think, have ratified UNCLOS. And they're refusing to accept the award of UNCLOS, which they have ratified. So I think these are all the, sometimes when you become a bigger power, you can play these games. But ultimately, India, as you know, is committed to a rule-based international order. And UNCLOS is an absolutely vital part of that rule-based international order. And about joint exercises in the United States, I think it's a very sweeping statement to say that they have got a big brotherly attitude. Let me also say that a very small instance, when we put these proposals for listing of terrorism, US was the only country which went as a co-signatory when in our listing. So they are in many ways, they have shared values, shared outlook on certain issues with us. But they also differ on certain issues, and that is natural, frankly. So I think in spite of the fact that we have our differences, I think our convergence are not only far more, but they are also genuine convergences. They are not a convergence of convenience. So I think I'd hesitate to very much brand the United States as a so-called big brotherly attitude. Huh?
Good evening, sir.
Yeah.
Sir, as you just now mentioned, as a nation which aspires to become a Vishwaguru, what's our take on the need for veto, sir? Is it really a game changer or a game breaker, sir? Do you see that, is there any need for the overhauling of the institutions?
Made a note, yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Who else? Yeah. Can you give a mic to that gentleman, please?
Very good evening, everyone. Of course, India is performing very well. Dr. Subramaniam Swamy has given, A+ when it comes to external affairs. It's more than economy. That's a different story. During the Cold War, of course, we had NAM. It has become irrelevant to some extent, according to think tanks, intelligentsia. And now, the China is rising. And to counter that, we talk about in the Indian Ocean, the very Quad, and various measures, of course. And there is also a threat from China's Belt Road Initiative. In one study, people are talking about by mid-21st century, 50% of the nations could be communist countries. The China Belt Road, that initiative may make, the nations
I hope
China
remains a communist country.
No doubt at all. No doubt at all. No doubt at all. It's like, that democracy getting promoted, maybe communism getting promoted through BRI. We come to know. So in this context, how do you feel? Do you think, that NAM is relevant once again here? Or is it Cold War 2.0 once again alive?
Yeah. No, thank you.
We can talk about that.
Thank you for this.
Please, sir. Thank you.
One last question, yeah.
Sir, the India's allocation to UN in the last year is drastically reduced from 400 crores to 200 crores. Why it is? And our diplomatic strength is very pathetic. It is compared to New Zealand. It is just like two cricket teams playing in the global scenario. Our enemy are going to be an enemy. China got 7,500 people. We got only 1,000 people. What is your comment on that?
Thank you. Now, I'll just say about Vishwaguru and veto. Let me just say that, veto is a reality. And when it was introduced, maybe there was some logic to it. I'm not suggesting there is logic to it now, but when they won the World War and they formed the World Institution, the winners of the war felt that this institution should not go the way the world went earlier. And they wanted a veto to make sure that the institution survived, their values survived, and humanity survived. So they had a very idealistic view of this, and they felt that keeping the veto would help that. Now, over a period of time, when I said, as I mentioned, we had 51 countries, and we have now 193. Now, when we talk about values, the question we are asking is, whose values? You have a G7, for example. You have a Japan in G7. Whose values are you talking about in G7? So these are all questions which are coming. There are many countries which are asking these questions. Now, therefore, when it comes now, the veto has actually become a hindrance to better governance, to addressing conflicts. And that is exactly why we need the veto to go. Because I feel that when other countries get into the... let's assume the veto remains. And let's assume that the council expands to 15 or by permanent members. Now, if 5 or 3 African countries are going to say, hey, for Somalia or for Ethiopia or for Central African Republic, this is what we want, I challenge any of the 5 permanent members with a veto to veto it. It's going to be difficult. And that is why we need permanent members from the region to be represented so that their interests will be protected. So I think veto is certainly, it's something which has outlived its utility, but there are ways of doing it. So with the reform, I'm confident that somewhere down the line, the veto will go, and if it doesn't go, it will become, in many ways, very difficult to exercise in a reformed Security Council. Regarding Cold War, NAM, and I just wanted to mention one thing. When Cold War was there, it was between United States and Soviet Union. See, between them, there were hardly anything going on. If you look at that sort of a pie chart or something, you will find that where they intersected was not much. Because it is a different system, this different system, they had a background. But now, if you look at the top 2 powers, which is China and the United States, they have a whole lot of interlinkages. In fact, it is practically impossible for the United States to disengage from China, just as it is impossible for China to disengage from the United States. So therefore, the Cold War, if it comes, will be very, very different. India could take a position at that time and say that, yes, we will not take sides, and this is what... But however, now, when the two are completely interconnected, supply lines are very close. And even to disrupt supply lines, let's assume that tomorrow they take a drastic decision to disrupt this from China is going to take a decade or more. And it's not going to help either of them. Both the countries will suffer. So I think we are now so interconnected that it's not going to happen the way we looked at it earlier. So that's the way I look at it. And finally, the amount which is given, certainly the allocation of money in our budget has gone down, but not the allocation of money to the UN. See, it happens all the time. Since I've been in government, let's assume that there is 400 crores which we need to invest or to give to a particular country. But whereas how it is, in the budget they will give you only 250 crores. But when the revised budget comes, they'll give you the rest of the 150 because they want to know whether you're actually spending it. But in the UN, most of these are actually levied through a very transparent calculation. So you have to pay it. And frankly, we already paid. We are one of the first countries to pay our share. They call it assessed share to the UN. And that is determined in a very transparent scale. So we have to pay that irrespective of how much we allocate in the budget. So I don't think beyond a point we should read too much into it. That is my feeling. That when it comes to our interests, when it comes to protecting our interests, I'm sure that the allocation will come. It may not come in this, but may come in the revised stage. So that's a way I'd like to reassure myself. And as for a diplomatic strength, you're talking to the wrong person. because I am the one who has been there, and I really wish we had at least 10 people more than what we had in the Security Council in our mission. And see, let me put it this way. There is a systemic issue in our, the way we are looking at personnel in government. And it also affects the other services as well. It affects us. We are one of the smallest diplomatic service in the world. And therefore, it becomes difficult for us to be in many places at the same time. Given our stature, given the fact that we're fifth largest economy and person aspiring, we're certainly nowhere near that. So that I acknowledge. But how it will be done, it's not been an easy decision. That's the best I can say.
Thank you for the informative and intriguing session, sir. Now I would like to call upon EML student heads, Jay and Malavika, to felicitate Tirumurti sir with memento. And also I request Tirumurti sir to leave a note for the IITM community in the EML yearbook.
It is my pleasant duty to thank my dear colleague Tirumurti for that very engaging, very patient and absolutely erudite speech on what India did in the Security Council, though he covered a vast panorama of other subjects too. And what came out very clearly is the old dictum that there are no permanent friends, there are no permanent enemies, it is only permanent interests, and India has acted in its own best interests when it comes to whether it's domestic policy, whether it is foreign policy. We do not kowtow to others' interests or others' perceived interests. We pursue what is in our own national interest. I think that came out very clearly. Let's give him a big hand. Let me also thank the IIT Madras and all of you for having come out in large numbers, supported initiatives like the CIC. We endeavor to bring the best minds across India and even visiting from abroad to audiences like yours, and we hope that you would continue to encourage us in our endeavor. So you are welcome to attend any of our events. We will keep you posted. Next event would probably be on the 8th, and this would be on Invest Tamil Nadu. So we would be talking about the problems of entrepreneurship in Tamil Nadu, the problems of investing, and there would be a representative not only from the government but from across the ecosystem. So we hope that if you are interested, please do join us. We'll let you know on the venue and other details in due course. We have your coordinates. So thank you very much. Thank you, IIT. Thank you all for attending this session, and welcome to our future sessions too. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir. Now I would like to invite UPSC Club Head Himanshu Singh to deliver the vote of thanks.
Hello, good evening everyone. First and foremost, I would like to thank our special guest Tirumurti sir, who despite his busy schedule has taken his time to interact with all of us. I extend my special thanks to Chennai International Center for this fruitful collaboration for this wonderful event. We would also like to thank Professor Thalai Rajan and Chandramouli sir for their immense support in making this event as a successful event. A special thank to Dean Student Vasa sir and our faculty advisor Vasa sir for their support and guidance throughout the event. I, on behalf of UPSC Club, express special gratitude to Team EML for providing us the opportunity to have us as a publicity partner and attend this interesting lecture. Last but not least, I thank the audience, the enthusiastic general student body, faculty and resident from within the campus, as well as the guests from in and around Chennai for being here with us today. Thank you, and I hope you all had a great session with Tirumurti sir. Have a wonderful evening ahead. Thank you.